Lessons from Veterans Day. Now, this section might seem out of place, but it isn't. Trust me, there are quite a few lessons to be gleaned from Veterans Day, but there are two that are actually just one. But there are two that I want you to walk away with. But first, Veterans Day is not Memorial Day. These two holidays get conflated. On Memorial Day, we tend to honor living soldiers, and on Veterans Day, we tend to honor dead soldiers. But Memorial Day was intended to remember the soldiers who never came home, those who died in foreign wars or from the injuries sustained in battle, and used to be recognized by decorating the graves of fallen soldiers. While Veterans Day serves to honor all veterans, all those who have served the country in war or peace, the ones who did come home, both living and now dead, but typically the holiday is intended to thank living veterans for their sacrifices. However, this confusion and conflation is understandable because everywhere else in the world has their Remembrance Day, their Memorial Day on November 11th. Why? Because on November 11th, 1918, on the 11th hour, so on the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, the Allies and Germany enacted an armistice, effectively ending the Great War. And November 11th was thus designated Armistice Day. The U.S. Congress recognized it as the official end of the war in 1926, and in 1938, November 11th became an official holiday, a day set aside to honor veterans of the Great War, the war to end all wars. But it didn't end all wars, I mean. We had World War II, most spectacularly, and at the insistence of veterans organizations, Congress amended the original holiday, renaming it. No longer would it be Armistice Day, referring only to World War I, but it would now be called Veterans Day, with the intent the day should honor American veterans of all wars. And thus, it was a national holiday to honor all our men in uniform, and it was celebrated this way for 30 years without incident and with much fanfare. Then, in 1968, to try to stimulate the economy, Congress passed the Uniform Holiday Bill to ensure that some or most federal holidays would be celebrated on a Monday. Apparently, 3-day weekends are good moneymakers for travel, tourism, and shopping. Anyway, the Uniform Holiday Bill passed by Congress to stimulate the economy put most federal holidays on Monday, and this included Veterans Day. And thus, the holiday was, for some reason, to be celebrated on the fourth Monday of every October, presumably to give it some distance from Thanksgiving, always held on the fourth Thursday of November, while keeping it relatively close to the original November 11 date. This new policy, which was passed in 1968, took place in 1971. But implementation was confusing, as from 1919 through 1970, the holiday had always been celebrated on November 11th, and Americans just wanted to celebrate it on November 11th. I mean, that's 51 years it was celebrated a certain way, and now they wanted to switch it up. So, because there was pushback, on September 20th, 1975, Gerald Ford signed a law returning the holiday's observance to November 11th. But that law would not go into effect until 1978. So to recap, November 11th, 1918 signaled the end of the Great War, and it was designated Armistice Day, and its anniversary was celebrated every year all around the globe. In 1926, the U.S. Congress and the President stopped making annual proclamations and just proclaimed that it would be an annual celebration. And then in 1938, November 11th, Armistice Day, became an actual U.S. national federal holiday, a day set aside to honor veterans of the war to end all wars. But there were more wars, so veterans organizations again lobbied Congress to change this holiday, already a national or federal holiday. They changed it. They lobbied Congress to change it from honoring veterans just from World War I to a national federal holiday to honor all veterans of foreign wars. So at that point, November 11th was renamed Veterans Day, and that was in 1954. In 1968, Congress passed the Uniform Holiday Bill that would have Veterans Day not be on November 11th, but instead held on the fourth Monday of every October. But that law would not go into effect until 1971. It did not go over well, and in 1975, President Ford signed a law returning the holiday's observance to November 11th, but that law would not go into effect until 1978. There are some important and relevant lessons to be derived from this journey down history lane, especially as they relate to the us versus them conversation. I really hope you will be able to see the connections now, so pay attention. The first lesson is that laws are signed that are not implemented for years. Then the impact is not understood until it's implemented. And then it again takes years to reverse the original law. This is how the US government works. One Congress and president make a policy decision that they will never be held accountable for, as a different Congress and a different president will be in office by the time the policy is implemented. If the policy is a failure, they escape blame. But if it is a success, they can still take credit. If implementation was immediate, there might be pushback. When the issues are front and center, any passion against implementation still exists, and people can be fired up about the whole thing and blame the sitting government. Such backlash isn't usually worth the risk for politicians. But if they manage to absorb all the initial criticism in the moment and pass a law anyway, and then the law just sits there waiting for implementation 3 years from now, 4 years from now, 5 years from now, the passionate opposition has been nullified. There is now nothing to fight until implementation. And by then, the Americans' attention is on something completely different. This is how we have moved so far outside the will of the American people without most citizens even realizing it. This is not a mistake. Our politicians and government officials tend to put their power, their election or re-election, before the interests of the American people. So our politicians and government officials tend to put their power before the interests of the American people. So implementing their idea of what is best is more important than listening to constituents about what the constituents might think is best. Another good example of this, I think, is the Affordable Care Act. It was passed on Christmas Day 2009, but its first implementation would not go into effect until 2014. And the other major components went into effect even later than that. Then there was all this talk of repeal and replace in 2010. People were elected on that, but did they? Anyway, just another example, and I digress. So the first lesson is how the US government has moved us so far outside the will of the American people without them, without us even realizing it. And lesson 1 is actually very related to lesson 2. The second lesson to glean from the history of Veterans Day is that solidarity, acting and believing together, has power. Americans got on board with the Monday holiday plan for President's Day, Labor Day, Columbus Day, Martin Luther King Jr. Day, even Memorial Day, but not Veterans Day. People have power when acting in solidarity. That is the lesson. People have power when acting in solidarity. All our elites must do to prevent us from acting against them is to prevent us from believing and working together as one people against their will. They keep us distracted and divided so we don't unite against their plans. And through delayed implementation, they gain time to shift blame and restructure the narrative to counter any emerging criticism against their wider agenda.